The privilege of speaking first at this important conference comes with the duty to speak honestly and frankly. Giving advice soaked in sympathy, telling an audience largely what it wants to hear, is to let what may be good advice get blown away in a strong wind of thoughts and emotions for which there may be consensus, but the wind will not necessarily blow in a useful direction. Friends of states or parts of states in distress must be like doctors or surgeons. They must not tell the patient what the patient wants to hear, and nor must they respond to friends and relations of the patient to tell the patient what the friends or relations want them to say. And so to the topic of this conference. Is Srebrenica remembered, and will it always be? Will the genocide be counted as it should in the historical annals of this world? First, of several difficult propositions I will raise for you to consider, a few words about the crime of genocide and the difficulties it has caused and continues to cause as a chargeable crime. Coined, as we all know, only after the Second World War, and initially allowing by the Genocide Convention that states should bring actions against states to allege breaches of the Genocide Convention. It first featured as a charge against individuals at the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals, where the charge or the crime had been specifically included in the enabling statute. Its difficulties arise both for charges against states at the International Court of Justice and for charges against individuals at the international tribunals and courts. Its difficulties arise from the definition of genocide, which requires the mental state, proving in the mind of the individual or of the state or of the organization an intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and to do so by killing or in other ways. Not an easy, precise mental state to prove, and very uncomfortable to have in mind. In fact, not necessarily the worst of all mental states established in any criminal. For example, the pilots who flew their planes into the Twin Towers in New York almost certainly did not have genocidal intent. They had some other intent, but not a genocidal one. And one can unhappily, until and unless the world rids itself of the most devastating of weapons, one can easily imagine of subsequent crimes, graver in number and horror than any to date, that could be perpetrated by someone without the specific, focused genocidal intent. And we all need to have that in the back of our minds as we think about what we're doing and where we're going. And it's worth knowing these two little facts. Nothing now charged as genocide could not now be charged as crimes against humanity. And it is arguable that genocide as a crime derived ignobly from the United States of America's determination at the Nuremberg Trials not to have crimes of humanity against humanity cast so wide as to allow America to be brought to book for crimes committed against Negroes and Native Americans. A troubling thought. But the term of genocide is now part of every man's thought and speech as the gravest of crimes, and for the time being, at the very least, investigation of when it occurs is a proper priority of national and international bodies alike. It has been applied by courts to Srebrenica and to what happened there. It is the common language for most for those appalling events. Nevertheless, at this conference, as we look at those events and how they are labeled and remembered as genocide, we must ask, or we may be well advised to ask, some hard questions, which, let me make it quite plain, I don't ask out of any personal belief, negative or otherwise. I ask them because in the spirit of contemplation and research for ways forward, you should always take nothing for granted and ask those questions you don't want to ask. In this case, why do we want the world to remember the genocide at Srebrenica? For what purpose? What will better memory of those events achieve? What is the purpose beyond some form of retaliation for the crimes that were committed? We've heard some answers already from the opening welcomes. But remember, those are questions we have to answer before we spend time and emotion on the way ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, let me suggest to you from my position as a non-native, as a non-victim of this or of any other crime, not closely related and simply having the fortune, the opportunity to look at this and similar events from a professional point of view, let me tell you this. Srebrenica is remembered, but no longer that well. And there is no guarantee of its being that well remembered in decades and centuries to come. The increase in mass communication is responsible for that state of affairs, but not to blame. It was in part the ability of the world to communicate by television, now, of course, television and the internet, that brought the tragedy of Srebrenica to the public attention so quickly. It is television and the internet that has brought so many other current and indeed historic tragedies to the public attention, so that the attention of the world citizen on any of these events, such as Srebrenica, is now necessarily diluted because it is one of many. Those of us in the fortunate parts of the world that are not in the middle or in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy of armed conflict have only a limited part of our lives to devote to the misfortune of others, a necessary truth for us all to accept. We come into life willing to contemplate the suffering of others, but not devoted to it as an exercise. That we must recognize. The natural dilution of focus or of interest in a particular event, such as Srebrenica, is affected by other, sometimes random acts. For example, whether or not there's an immensely strong pictorial image of a particular tragedy. The Holocaust has its gravity, but it also has this truth, flash for a second. A picture of the Nuremberg Trials, and everyone in this room and most educated people in most countries around the world know what it is. It is an image that has stuck. Ask for an image of the killing by Stalin of millions. There is none. Ask for a defining picture of the grave crimes against humanity committed by America against the North Vietnamese? Maybe. But for many, none. And without a strong image, however distasteful or unpleasant, the memory can fade. And there are other reasons that bring some tragedies to mind better than others. Sometimes it's the support of a celebrity. Angelina Jolie was for a time, and may still be, associated in part with this as a tragedy, but there's a limit to how much an individual can do to raise it in the international public conscience. In other cases, there is active political publicity. In the case of the Holocaust, following perhaps 10 or 15 years, or 20 years even, of comparative low interest, there has been an unending amount of entertainment films and information books about the subject. You can perhaps recognize the variation in recollection by considering the Armenian problem. 100 years on, no living survivors, it is still an issue, apparently unresolved. And contrast that with Stalin. Or let me challenge you. Am I allowed to ask you to put your hands up? Yes, I am. Will you do it? Probably not. Let me try. How many of you know of the over 500,000 people killed in a massacre in 1965 in? Well, the experts know. How many of the rest of you knew of the Indonesian massacre? And if you didn't, go and look it up on the internet when you get home and ask why that 500,000+ is not known. Ladies and gentlemen, the number of enthusiastic volunteers from around the world who are keen to help and have been keen to help Bosnia, the victims of Srebrenica and of all the other crimes committed in your country, are necessarily reducing in numbers as time passes, and before long it will only be historians outside your own country who will have concern to set the record straight. So these difficult questions and answers, which explain why this conference is so important, and indeed why it came into being at all, perhaps lead in a common sense way to this approach. It's the approach, isn't it? We take as our children embark on adult life, unhappy about the problems they face in careers, in education. We tell them, no one owes you a living. You go out and you get it yourself. And that, in the most rugged way, is what we must understand here in Bosnia. The record you want others to have will not come about unless you take every positive step you can to ensure that that will happen. And you fight immense powers that will oppose it. Take a very easy parallel example: Burma. For long enough, Aung San Suu Kyi, the liberal leader imprisoned for decades, was taken seriously by the West. The people who were persecuted and killed by the junta there were the subject of sympathetic concern and recognition that there should be an international tribunal to deal with what had happened. But then things changed. Aung San Suu Kyi was released. The beaches of Burma welcomed the tourists. The minerals from Burma welcomed the commercial investors. And what do the governments say now? Forget it. Effectively, forget it. No justice, no record will be cast by the international community for those in Burma who suffered as badly as they did. And even if you get something like this problem before the courts, whether the ICTY or the International Court of Justice, many, one hopes most, of the judges will be pure in thought and conscientious in conduct. But from my own experience of the ICTY, it was very clear that political pressures led to the blackening out from public view of critical documents that stopped me producing intercepts of what passed between Milosevic and Mladic at the time of Srebrenica and Žepa, that stopped us investigating the chain of command above the Scorpions once the Scorpions had been revealed for what they were. And incidentally, that limitation on the power of international courts is now being reflected in Kosovo, where there has been no investigation by the Serbian courts at any level to show who dealt with both the extreme violence in towns like Peć, but also with the movement of the bodies from Kosovo up to Serbia. There are many political influences at work, even on the tribunals, and those of you knowledgeable in this field will know of what happened in Rwanda, when the other side of the conflict, Tutsis and Hutus, was the subject of pressure to be investigated, thwarted by the leader of the Tutsis. What happened in Uganda when a case was referred to the court in order that the court could be used to favor one side of a conflict, not to investigate both. And there are other examples, Cambodia being just one where you can find public record. And as to the ICTY itself, what does one make of recent decisions which started to cause concern to ICTY watchers and academics, followed by one judge asserting in a letter or email to 60 of his closest friends that he'd been subject to improper pressure by the presiding judge to make decisions contrary to his conscience. You can't say he was right. There are difficulties in his account. But it shows, and we must accept, that official record-making bodies, courts and the like, are not invulnerable to improper approach. This is the environment in which we live, and the environment in which you wish to leave the best record of what happened in Srebrenica. It is the sort of reality of which your friends, as doctors or surgeons, must warn you. You will hear later how one country has, from the very beginning, recognized that courts may be powerful in and may serve the purposes of writing or rewriting history in their own interest. Bosnia is not that country, although it is Bosnia's history that is at risk. Well, like the doctor asking the patient what the patient really wants from the treatment she or he may receive, I must ask what it is that Bosnia wants to achieve in the processes we consider today. And I've asked this, along with others, for several years. And although I have come to believe that what is wanted is the setting of a correct and accurate record, more than the obtaining of revenge, more even than seeing a leader do that which Adenauer did. What unfortunately has not necessarily yet been visible is signs of willingness by this state of yours to do what must be done if, like the child receiving the advice of the parent, it accepts that no one else, neither a court nor an international body, owes it a living or will necessarily do anything to set the record straight if the interests of the court or the body or the international body are not served by that process. There are less than 2 years left for the International Court of Justice decision to be the subject of an attempt at revision. The judgment was always unsatisfactory. It was arguably political. It was undoubtedly brought on evidence less than would now be available, although to go for a revision there has to be a trigger of new material, as many of you will know, and there has then to be immediate action. It will be very difficult. But why hasn't it been tried? Let me tell you something, as the ordinary lawyer I am, and certainly was for many decades. If you think of going to law, but don't, you can be certain of one thing: you will fail. If you think of going to law and you think you might fail, but you try hard, well, you might fail. You might try again and again, and then you might be surprised. Seeking the assistance of the law is not for the faint-hearted. It is not something anybody else is going to do for you. You have to do it yourself. And there are other mechanisms by which wounded bodies can effectively take the law into their own hands or make the law with their own hands when international organizations fail them, have failed them, or look as though they will fail them. And these other mechanisms are now far easier than once they were because of international communication made cheap and easy by the internet. Informal tribunals, and again, those of you who don't know about them, I shall set you some homework. International tribunals set up and run according to proper principles and regard for the rule of law leave a record. And that record may be, now and in centuries to come, the only evidence-based record for historians and others to look back on. In 100 years' time, somebody says, Vietnam, what happened there? The only evidence-based record is of an informal tribunal, many flaws in it, set up by a man called Lord Russell. If people ask, well, comfort women, were women abused by the Japanese soldiers in the Second World War? Doesn't seem very likely. They can find, from 2000, a full legal judgment of an informal tribunal set up run by a former presiding judge of the Yugoslav tribunal, which in several hundred pages finds the emperor of Japan, shielded from the dock by the politics of the United States and by General MacArthur, finds him guilty on evidence. And there are many other tribunals. But to set up either to go to the International Court of Justice or to find some other mechanism whereby the record you want to be left as a lasting and accurate memory of the awful events of Srebrenica is in your hands, and as time passes, increasingly it will be obvious that no one else will help you. Thank you.